The American Teilhard Association podcast features conversations and interviews which explore the life, thought, and vision of mystic scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. We express our gratitude to Dalesford Abbey in Paoli, Pennsylvania, for allowing us to use their space and equipment in making this episode possible. Dr. Diana Walsh Pasulka is Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Her work bridges the gap between religious studies, technological advancements, and the enigmatic realm of UFO phenomena, now called UAP. Her studies transcend the academic boundaries, captivating audiences through insightful publications, media appearances, and thought-provoking lectures. Dr. Pasulka's research focuses on religion, technology, and emerging religious movements. Her most recent titles are American Cosmic, UFOs, Religion and Technology in 2019, and Encounters, Experiences with Nonhuman Intelligences in 2024. Welcome, everyone, to the American Teilhard Association podcast. We have with us today Dr. Diana Walsh Pasulka. Diana, thank you so much for being with us.
So happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
We're really grateful to have you on as a guest. You have a perspective on not just one field, I want to say, but many fields that we are approaching an integration of. And I think a lot of hungry minds and spirits within the ATA are really going to eat up this conversation that we're going to have today. So to begin, can you explain your evolution from the study of religious studies to the integration of UFOs, UAPs, and what we are referring to now as the phenomenon?
Yes. So this was a surprise to me, but this is, first I want to say something about my discipline, which is religious studies, which a lot of people don't actually know about. So it's not confessionally based. So it's an academic discipline. And in my department alone, we have several different disciplines represented, but they all do religious studies. So we have archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, and all other types of people who study religion. Why is it important to study religion? Because most people in the world are religious. So if you look at the world's population, the demographics are that at least 80% of people in the world are affiliated with some religion. So it's important to know we have students like business students, STEM students, it's all over the map, really, the types of students we have. And we don't advocate for any religion. So a lot of people think, oh, this is a person who's talking about religion, they must be advocating for a religion. No, we're actually advocating for the study of religion because we think it's important. A lot of us are religious. Some are Buddhists, some are Muslim, some are, I'm Catholic. So, but we don't bring that into our work as a discipline, just like you wouldn't really necessarily bring that into your math or whatever discipline you have. So we it's called bracketing. That doesn't mean, though, that what we study doesn't impact how we believe. It definitely does, and it has in my case as well. All right, so how did I get to study the topic of what's commonly known as UFOs? And this is a very good question, by the way, because sometimes I think, how did I do this again? Why did I do this? So I was I traditionally studied Catholicism, the history of Catholicism and Christianity, with a focus on how popular culture and technologies like screen culture basically impact how we practice and believe our religion. So today we can see a lot of homilies online. 30 years ago we couldn't. That shifts how we practice religion. So the reason I do this is because I grew up on the cutting edge, kind of, near Silicon Valley. I was one of probably the first students when I was in the 8th grade to have a computer. They were kind of beta testing it on groups of kids in California. So we got that technology. We had a kind of first glimpse of it as it was rolling out. So, and I went to school in that area. So first for my undergraduate and then my master's degree before I went to New York to get my PhD. So I had a front row seat. I was also, as a job, basically through grad school, I went to the Jesuit School of Theology. It was in Berkeley at the time. So I was with priests in formation and all kinds of people who were divinity students. And I was there to get an academic degree. I took classes at UC Berkeley as well. And I also went to talk to, not to talk to, but to attend Rene Girard's colloquium at Stanford University, which
Oh,
was
wonderful.
really amazing. Yeah. So I had a unique position to look at how technology and the infrastructure was fast developing and shifting culture. And this was something I continued to look at even as I studied Catholic culture. My first book was about the topic of purgatory and how popular culture impacted those beliefs and practices from like 1200 on to 1800. That took a long time to write. So after that, I was on to the next, I got tenure and I was on to the next project, which was going to be about Bishop John England, who's a real character, knew a lot of the founding fathers in the that time period of the United States, lived here in the South. I had a lot of primary source data on him, and I wanted to write a book about him, and I probably will someday. But what happened was that at the end of doing this research on purgatory, I went to a lot of archives and I looked at historical records. Archives, of course, are libraries of old manuscripts and things that aren't digitized, by the way, most, right? So a lot of libraries are wanting to do that, but they just don't have the money or the human power to do it. So, archives are still super important. So I went to them, and a lot of them in the United States, Catholic archives. Um, and I looked at records that had to do with purgatory. And what I saw was that a lot of the things that they'd see, Catholics in history would see things in the sky. And a lot of times they couldn't um, put them in a category. They didn't have categories for them, just like other people, right? So today, when we see things in the sky, we tend to have categories: airplane, drone. Well, the UFO, I don't know what that thing is, unidentified. So Catholics had their own categories. So this had nothing to do with purgatory unless they were like souls going up to heaven, which sometimes they were for Catholics during that time period. So I took copious notes. And at the end of the time period, finishing that book in around 2011, I turned in my manuscript and I had all of these historical records, right? And I didn't know what to do with them. I thought they were odd, but I wasn't going to pursue them maybe later, after my John England book. But I happened to give them to a friend and he looked them over and he said, "These are really cool." He said, "They remind me of Steven Spielberg films." And
Mm.
I was like, I thought he was crazy. And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "UFOs." And I said, No, that's silly." And so I dismissed it. But something was intriguing to me, and that was that, it was popular culture again, right? So he was looking at these reports that Catholics made about aerial phenomena of their time period, and he was
Mm.
thinking about popular culture. And so I thought that kind of goes along with what this book I just wrote about purgatory and popular culture. So I went ahead and I went to oh, he did tell me there was a conference for UFO experiencers. So UFO
Okay.
experiences are people who've seen UFOs or believe that they're experiencing continued activity with respect to UFOs. So
Mm.
I went to this conference. It happened to be near me. And I saw people there who were well-known experiencers. And I realized that what they were talking about sounded so similar to what I'd been studying that I thought I could do, kind of like, which isn't popular in academia, by the way, which is to do this kind of transhistorical study of
Sure.
comparing, this really ancient stuff or old stuff with contemporary stuff. Academics say you can't really do that, but I was like, I'm going to do that anyway because it looks
Mhm.
really interesting and maybe I'll learn something, right? So I started to do that. I started to study this, and that's how it began.
Mm.
When I got into the study, I just have to say a few more things about it. My thesis was, I thought, pretty easy to show, was that, let's just take an example. In the 1800s, when, say, a nun in a convent would see aerial phenomena, and I have one of these examples, and I put it in my Purgatory book,
Mhm.
she'll see it and she'll think it's a soul from purgatory that needs to be prayed back into purgatory.
Mm.
Doesn't know where it's at, right? It's confused. Okay. So I thought, how easy, all I'll do is show that, the cultural conventions of that time, implicated their ideas and they implicate our ideas. We have Star Trek, we have Star Wars, we have, X-Files. We have all of these now documentaries and things like that about UFOs. Of course, we're going to see UFOs.
Mm.
I thought it was pretty easy, but it wasn't, because what started to happen was that people from the space program, um, and aeronautical companies, aerospace companies, and things like that started to want to correspond with me and talk to me about my research.
Mm.
And they were coming from the perspective that these were real, that these unidentified objects were actually real. And they had credentials, right? And they were intelligent. And so I was shocked. So I went through a series of shifts through the study of the phenomena, as we call it now. And I began to see it as perennial, as something that's always been here, and that we may look at in different ways and we may have dominant cultural interpretations, but at basis there are patterns that are incredibly interesting and that match, like they're pattern matches. And this is what the aerospace people were interested in, and this is what I was interested in. So I had to change the way I did my work. And you can see that in my book, American Cosmic. You can see me grappling with this. And I worked with those people. So I worked with those people for 6 years. And that's how I started to study this.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction to your journey, and I'm sure it's resonated with you on so many levels, from your mind to your heart to your being, because, like you alluded to, it's the confoundment. This topic of what lies beyond is the confoundment of our siloed institution systems, right? There's not a lot of cross communication, or traditionally there hasn't been, between academic fields or fields of study beyond academia into the professional fields and hard sciences. But like you said, this is coming from some sort of non-linear perspective, right? Where it's not just like time is a linear thing, but rather it might have cycles and spirals to it, and there may be a compounding and concressing nature to it, that this topic really calls the entirety of our being in order to engage with it and be able to parse apart some aspects of meaning and relevance with it. But yeah, I mean, I've been very grateful to have come across you and your work, and now we've been able to connect, which is awesome. Because really, what got me into theology when I was fresh out of, with my bachelor's degree out of undergrad, I was really kind of probing with these questions of, well, what is an extraterrestrial? What is something that is beyond our terrestria? Is that an angel? Is it a demon? We have records of these things within religious traditions. I mean, for me, I'm raised Roman Catholic, so that's what's closest to me, like yourself. But like yourself, I was like, this rings true. This sounds familiar. And it was not really until I found the work of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin that I was able to then wrap some theological meat around those bones of intuiting this connection, right? So I'm curious, because I know his name has come up within your work. He's someone that you've researched and applied. But how did you come to encounter the work and thought of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and how has it influenced you?
Yeah, so I don't know if there are any Catholic academics who don't know his work, and I could be wrong. Okay, some could be looking, at this podcast and say, "Oh, wait, that's me. I don't know who he is."
You'll
Honestly,
enlighten them.
yeah, he was. His work was always fascinating to me, but I read it for fun. I didn't read it for, helping me. Well, of course, it's fun to try to understand life and to try to understand our place in life. So I was introduced to his work as an undergraduate and then continued reading his work as a graduate student, because obviously he was onto technology. But it wasn't until I was doing this work that I recognized how onto technology he was. And also, during this time period that I was doing this work, when I started to work with the aerospace people, um, I started to do a historical look at the Russian and the American space programs. And when I went back to look at them, I'm like everyone else. I had assumptions about the linear progression of the space programs and how they were scientific. And we assume that science has nothing to do with spirituality. But when you
Hmm.
look at our space program and the Russian space program, those assumptions are they just disappear. Okay. You
Yeah.
cannot hold those assumptions because they're not true. So at the basis of both of those programs, you see Constantine Chikovski, right? For the Russians. And, they extended it's not Christianity as Catholics believe it, but it is a form of Russian Christianity, a
Right.
form of, and so he's looking at beings that he calls angelic beings who are, in a sense, extraterrestrial or interdimensional. It's hard to say exactly what he thinks, but he believes that this is the Russian cosmos I'm talking about right now.
Mhm.
And this is the basis, the ideology of that space program in its infancy. And it's very spiritual. And they
Right.
believe there are certain things that they believe that I recognized in Chardin's work. One is that the idea of the supernatural, or the idea that there's a dualism of matter and spirit, is not, that doesn't obtain for the Russians, at least for the Cosmos and for Chardin. So if you see his work, the spirit of matter, I mean, he's really talking about kind of this incarnational idea. And so
Hmm.
so I saw that. And I also saw that he was also talking about, a cosmic idea of Christ. And so were they. Okay. So were they. Then, so that was the first thing. In our own space program, we have Jack Parsons. Okay. Now,
Hmm.
Jack Parsons is in no way Christian or Catholic or anything like that. Some say that he's demonic. Okay. And I don't see it that way. I read his letters to, he did work with Aleister Crowley. Okay. I mean, there is that. But what he was doing was definitely not the straight up kind of conservative science that we would associate with our NASA or with, our own space programs. No way. It was completely different. And that was shocking to me. So this was another level of shock that I had to go through in doing this kind of work, was seeing that the people who were instrumental in getting human beings off of Earth into space, the Russians did it first, were really spiritual and didn't
Hmm.
take science and extract it from spirituality. Not at all. Okay. It
Yeah.
was so inextricable from what they were doing. So that definitely, there were some other things. So Chardin uses the term the noosphere,
Hmm.
and this is created by this idea was created by a Russian. So Chardin was right at that time period, the early 20th century, late 1800s, early 20th century, looking at, he knew about the cosmists. Okay. I can't see that he actually ever referenced them, but it's clear he worked with a mathematician who was French, who worked with Vernadsky, who's the one who
Hmm.
coined Noosphere. And so Vernadsky was really intelligent, and he was did the same kind of work as Chardin, right? Kind of paleontology and looking at geology and that type of thing. And
Hmm.
what he saw was that there was a biological sphere, right? There was a geological sphere, and now human culture would produce another type of sphere, and this would be like a combination of culture, science, art, all these kinds of things. And
Right.
that this would create this other sphere, which he then called the noosphere. And then, of course, Chardin talks about the noosphere a lot. So there's a lot of cross-pollination between
Hmm.
the cosmists, who as a course of looking into this, what I would call an American cosmic. I even named my book after this tradition, this American cosmist type of idea. And
Yeah.
so it runs. through our science, but we're very careful, especially at the level of like NASA and the Air Force and, military, to basically separate as much as possible these two
Mhm.
spheres, the spirit and science, right? Spiritual questions and matters and science. But it doesn't seem like that you can keep that assumption. Another thing
Right.
that happened during the research was that the as American Cosmic came out, I became I more immersed, you could call it, within the military scene in terms of the people who are studying UFOs, which they now call UAP. And it seemed to me that there were levels of these programs that studied this, and at some of the highest levels, they don't make that assumption that there's a separation between spirit and, spirituality and science. They don't make that at all. A lot of them are incredibly educated about
Mhm.
the history of esotericism and science. So this is what I found, and it was kind of shocking to me because I would call myself normal, kind of, my ideas were very normal in the sense that
Yeah.
I just accepted what the assumptions were, I just accepted those assumptions.
Sure, and that makes sense because we would only normally look toward a government with a rational mind to be this very up and up governing system and body that's thinking very logically, and to then learn that their influences are coming from a spiritual dimension could be for some people concerning, especially when we consider how collectively, I'm talking about as a human collective, not just as a national collective in any sense. Our spiritual evolution is debatable in that sense. Like, really, how spiritually evolved are we? How many people in the world are really living Christ-like in that way, or at least, for part of their day? We have our moments, right?
Right.
Um, and yeah, that's so interesting that you mentioned that difference between the Russians and then the United States, because I know, and this is not to make any sort of commentary on geopolitics or anything, but I just know that from Teilhard's perspective, when he was studying the Eastern Fathers and then the Western Fathers, the Greek and the Latin Fathers, he was more had a greater proclivity to the thought of the Eastern Fathers because their cosmology was more dynamic and it made room for the Holy Spirit in a way that those of the East and the Latin Father or the Western Fathers really didn't, and it didn't resonate with him as much. I mean, Teilhard took qualms with the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founding member of his community, the Jesuits, because there were cosmological inaccuracies within that. He found it difficult to enter into his prayer fully because Ignatius was praying with a more medieval worldview when it came to this kind of thing. And I was just having this conversation a couple weeks ago with Dr. John Haught, who is one of the foremost Teilhard scholars, and how despite our evolution in terms of things like science and engineering, our spiritual evolution is not on par. We are still in the Middle Ages while our scientific worldview is just progressing. So yeah, there's so much challenge within that. But you make that point about that perceived separation of spirit and matter, right? Now, Teilhard is accredited with a quote to the degree, and I can't cite it off the top of my mind, but spirit, or I'm sorry, matter is spirit moving slowly enough to be seen. And
That's
we
right.
might say heard and tasted and touched and
Yes.
experienced, right?
Yes.
So how do you understand the spiritual nature of the phenomenon?
Yeah, okay. So that's a really good question and one that's actually difficult for me to talk about only because I'm still trying to understand it. And I think that that's why a lot of the military aerospace people came to me because they were like, help us understand this. And I was like, I don't know. Like this is wow, just kind of very surprising. Um, the way I look at it is that religions already have, taxonomies of these types of other intelligences. And we've, with the Enlightenment and the focus on rationalism, we've thrown it out. We've thrown out those taxonomies. We don't even talk about them. We don't believe in them. Okay, even people who are professed Christians don't believe in them. Okay, mostly. I would say that that's wrong, but let's just say that a lot of denominations, you go to church and so forth, but nobody ever like, um, at least in my experience, it's not talked about, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so to me, what happened during the phase where I was beginning to understand that people in the government were looking at UFOs as real, I started to think, okay, this is where religion is is super relevant today because we already have that language and we have taxonomies of angels and non-human intelligences, and we have a lot of references in the Bible to life, other worlds.
Mm-hmm.
I just wrote uh, an essay for Oxford University Press's, I guess it's called the Oxford Research Encyclopedia,
Mm-hmm.
and it's for literature. And it was a very long essay, by the way, but it went through the whole history of the Western idea of, and threw some indigenous in there too, because I know indigenous people who helped me out here, um, of other worlds. And it goes
Mm-hmm.
back pre-Christian to Greeks, at least, where you have written accounts of people speculating about life on other planets, right? And of course, we all know Emanuel Swedenborg, who wrote a
Mm-hmm.
book called Life on Other Planets in the 1700s, and it was a bestseller. And it's still out there, by the way. People can still get that.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I think that what my help to the people who were doing this governmental work was that I was able to then uh, talk about that to them and say, this is what we think, people who are religious think about this kind of experience. And what was really shocking to me was that things that I had been very familiar with, like the angel events, the angel contact events, which are very
Mm-hmm.
represented in the Catholic historical record, going back and looking at the primary source data of those accounts really shifted them because, they were told, they were experienced by people, then they were told to other people, and then at some point they were represented in art. And then
Mm-hmm.
that became conventional, just like, there are conventions of writing letters, dear so and so, there are conventions of jokes, like knock knock jokes. We know those conventions, right? So there are artistic conventions. This is how this should be represented. It should only be represented this way. And so angels took on these representations. But if you go back to the primary source data, you see that they didn't look like that. So again, that what they did look like were things that people were talking about today. And so
Yeah.
I had access to the primary source data, and in fact, this is recorded in American Cosmic. At the last, in fact, it's the last chapter because it in a linear narrative, it happened last. I went to the Vatican and I spent time at the Vatican Observatory, um, and also at the, which was used to be called the Secret Archive, but is now the Apostolic Archive.
Mm.
And I was able to look at canonization records of Joseph of Cupertino and Maria of Agreda, right? And also a lot of information about the search for extraterrestrial life at the Vatican Observatory because they have their own archive. And
Mm-hmm.
it was wonderful. I took with me a person who was part of that aeronautic community who was a scientist and was very interested in studying this. And we looked at these, and I was able to explain, what they saw, what type of light they saw, that kind of thing. But we really went through the data so
Mm-hmm.
that it even shocked me. So I was shocked. So not just so he was shocked so much that he actually converted to Catholicism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think part of it was that we were immersed in a very devotional group of priests who we
Mm-hmm.
met there. And I don't think he'd ever experienced that. So I
Mm-hmm.
experienced it because I was at the Jesuit school, right? And a lot of my friends were nuns and sisters and monks and people like that. So you know that's not new to me, that kind of lifestyle. It was
Sure.
completely new to him. And
Mm-hmm.
not only was that, so he went from, I could see his journey at the Vatican, as he was, you know, we went on, there was a priest who did a lot of work at a hospital, giving unction and things like that, the
Mhm.
uh, oil and, for
Right.
people who are sick, and just the work of what priests do.
Yeah.
And he'd never seen that before. And so the priest said, "Come along with me," and he did. Um, and that really, really impacted him.
Hmm.
I knew what was going to happen. I felt it. I said to myself, this man has spent his whole life in our space program. You know, these big ideas about space, what's out there. We're just about to go to the observatory where he's going to meet Brother Guy Consolmagno and these astrophysicist monks who have not only spent their entire lives like him looking up at space, but they do it in a devotional way. And I
Hmm.
could just see that his kind of edifice of secular kind of, Christianity or whatnot was cracking. And then he went there, and that's when he said, "Okay, I'm gonna do this." So that was something that occurred in the end is recorded in the last chapter of that book.
That's fascinating. And like you said, you were raised in that environment. So for you, it was quite normal. And I can certainly, connect with that experience, especially working here at the Abbey with 19 priests. And yeah, for the majority of my working life, I've been working for, Catholic institutions in some form. But to see that form of radical devotion within a vocation is what a vocation is, right?
Yes.
Your vocation as a scholar, as a writer, as a mother, as all the things you are in your life, mine as a father, so forth and so on, right? That's what we are radically devoted to, and I think we live in a world of a lot of things, but so much distraction that our devotion is in a lot of ways inhibited. And it's a beauty, of Catholic tradition that we have these communities that share in some way a common spirituality that allows them to really enter into that mindset. And I don't know the person who you're referring to, but just out of presumption, being someone who's working with the government, aerospace, all that, they're probably an incredibly intelligent person, and living in their head, and to see such a radical embodiment of the heart is really moving. I like to say that in studying tarot for over 10 years now, 15 years, whatever it's been, it's really been like within the last 5 years of like watching my small family grow and just living a life that I've really started to like get what he means. And I couldn't articulate that to you in words all the times, but I see this living example, this embodiment of it. And I'm like, wow, that's it. That's what I want to be. That's what I aspire to evolve, to grow to, right? So I totally get that in a way, and that conversion experience is something that's powerful. Um, so yeah, I mean, you're talking about theology and the Roman Church in that way, but something else you said too is also really fascinating to me is that for a while I'm thinking like in particularly the like 2010s and like before that, atheism was really popular, right? Carl
Yeah,
Sagan,
I remember
Dawkins,
that.
all these people. And now we're seeing this turn back to Christianity. And what I find particularly interesting is there's a resurgence in orthodoxy and people
Yes.
going back to the Orthodox Church, which is arguably the original church in that way. And we're having this rediscovery of what the anthropomorphized version of an angel actually was in some sort of scriptural accuracy. So yeah, that was just a thought that came up as you mentioned, us having or be more common now for people to discuss these different categories, these taxonomies of angels and things like that. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, I agree. One thing also that I'm in the midst of using Chardon's work, which I'm in no way an expert on, by the way, but have to use it because it's absolutely relevant to the time period we're in now. And he also has a lot of commonalities with researchers that I'm looking at also, like Marshall McLuhan and
Hmm.
um, and Renee Girard.
Sure.
So what I found when I reread his work now, like The Heart of Matter, is that he had such a very well developed spiritual faculty. Okay. So his spiritual faculty was something that again, like when I looked at the cosmist tradition, the Russian cosmist tradition, they're not so this tradition, you're correct that people are going back to orthodoxy for a very good reason, because it's in my opinion, and no disparagement of our tradition, but
Hmm.
but it's much more focused on the development of the mystical connection to God,
The
to
interior
Jesus.
life. Yeah.
And, I think that we've lost that. We've gotten so rationalized in the Catholic
Hmm.
tradition. We're not, it's not even in our catechesis. I mean, it is, but it's not taught. So I have
Right.
5 kids, they went through, and so I'm, uh, so there are communities within Catholicism, like homeschool communities and things like that, that
Hmm.
that do teach this. But I do think that this actually should be taught, because it goes back to Thomas Aquinas, and it goes back to even further. Thomas Aquinas took Aristotle and redid a lot of what his amazing thinking was on this idea of a spiritual faculty. So I noticed this in Marshall McLuhan's work, and I noticed it in Chardin's work, and it's
Hmm.
this, it's this questioning of, like, they wonder, when people say, "How do you have this? Like, how do you feel this?" Um, the this mystical union, or how, and his question is, how do you not? Like, to
Yeah.
me, it's a sense, this is what I see when I see his work. It's a sense like seeing. Like, I can tell you what I see in the background. You've got some really cool art, right? And I especially like, it looks like a child's art
Thank
project.
you.
I love it, right? And so I see that, and you see it too. And so I don't doubt that you're seeing that, right? And so both McLuhan and Chardin have pages in their books where they say the same thing. They say, I feel this, and I don't know how you don't feel it. Like,
Yeah.
I know that it's true. I know the presence is real. I can feel
Mhm.
it. I can, to me, it's a sense. It's real. It's not metaphorical, right? So they're not talking about it as a metaphor. They're talking about it as something very literal. Now, Catholics would be very, I think it would do them a lot of good, the whole church, everything, in order to bring that tradition back and to
Mhm.
teach it again. So I'm going to talk about it in my book, because I think that, first, I think that's why a lot of people are, going to Orthodoxy,
Mhm.
Eastern Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy. And I think that that this is a thing that Catholics developed, um, and then was lost. I think it was in the Middle Ages that it was lost. I don't know. But I am going to talk about it, as because it's important to my work, because what UFOs are really, if we think about it, what did they bring to us? They brought the realization that these are real. They're not metaphorical. People aren't, this isn't a metaphorical type of being, or a metaphor,
Mhm.
especially when aerospace people have radar, and and actual, like, evidence of it, right?
Right.
Now, what these beings are, what scientists think these beings are, like the aerospace scientists I work for, is different than what Catholics think of, right? So, and they could be different. I don't know. So that when you ask me what's the spiritual nature of these things, I am still working on that. And
Mhm.
I think that, if anything, it just shows us that the world that God created is a way more complex and interesting world than we had thought before.
Yeah, I love that quote from evolutionary biologist JBS Haldane. The world is not what I'm going to forget it now. Um, Something about the world is queerer than we can suppose. It's not it's queerer than we suppose. It's queerer than we can suppose, right?
Right.
Um, yeah, yeah, that's interesting because someone like Carl Jung, for example, postulates that the UFO was psychic in nature, but that didn't mean it was immaterial. That didn't mean it was non-physical. And that's something that I find particularly interesting because when you consider Teilhard's thought, everything has a dimension of consciousness or spirit to it. We could say that even that rocks and dust and dirt have a consciousness to them because there is an attracting factor within them that is pulling those molecules and those atoms and quarks of whatever elements they're made of together, and it is holding them together. Now, this is a very rudimentary form of consciousness, we might say, but it develops over the course of evolution to the point where we have the human person and the prefrontal neocortex. And I would gather that that's a very spiritual being that we are becoming. I mean, if we go back to the book of Genesis, God is creating everything and he's saying it's good. You know, the earth and the skies and the waters and the animals are good. And then he gets to the human person and he says it's very good, right? And the human person is made in God's image and likeness. And we could talk about, what that means, but in terms of, being a spiritual being, reality having this spiritual nature to it, I am in the camp that everything has a spiritual nature to it. The chairs that we're sitting in right now, the walls behind us, the air we breathe, but there are like higher and higher manifestations of that. And that's a challenge when we are talking about something using the word alien, right? Because it implies it is different from us. And I can only postulate that so much of our inability to, and this goes back to what I said earlier about like we're so siloed in terms of our thought, but our inability to really approach this institutionally, societally, as a whole in some way, is because we are just so segmented and so broken apart in that way. And the spiritual life is really something that calls us into union, both within ourselves, like you as an individual, me as an individual, but then also us as a community. And beyond just like the Teilhard community or the theological community or the UFO community or the government, right? There's that human community. And that's where we really start to get into that cosmic nature of Christ, right? It's beyond that typical hypostasis of Jesus is human, divine. Well, Teilhard says that, well, yeah, that's true, but Jesus is fully cosmic in that way too, where he is present within every quark of existence, known and unknown in that way. Um, so, how would you say that this more like expansive view of Christ lends itself to your study? And it's something you referenced before.
Yes. So there's a sense of, um, I can't remember the exact phrase that he uses, the God of becoming, or the God that's not here yet, or something like that.
The not yet God, or this idea, he calls it the God of the ahead.
Yeah.
Rather than the God of the above, this old man in the sky, it's also this God of the ahead in the future.
Yeah, so this idea of unfoldingness, right? So,
Mhm.
things unfolding in the time, time period. He integrates this idea of process of like,
Yes.
time. And I think that's really interesting because obviously things change a lot. And so we're in an era now that is incredible, really. So, we're seeing AI, and in many ways, it's people have different reactions to it. And who talks about this actually is Mark Stallman. Mark Stallman is a Catholic, but he's also one of the architects of AI. So um,
Okay.
yeah. So he is his godfather was Norbert Wiener, who was literally one of the architects, if not the architect of AI back in the 1940s. Who, by the way, knew C.S. Lewis and was really interesting because he was homeschooled. And at
Hmm.
18, he earned a PhD at Harvard in philosophy, but he became a mathematician.
Hmm.
And then he worked on what he coined the term cybernetics. And he worked on machine learning and algorithmic feedback loops that were then used by the military. And once he saw that this happened in the 1940s, by the 1950s, he was writing books about morality and ethics.
Hmm.
And so I feature him in my book too, because he's really important.
Mhm.
So he, in a sense, saw where we're at now. He said, look, we're going to be utilizing this and it's going to get out of control unless we develop our spiritual faculty. He didn't use that word, but That's what he was talking about. He was talking about morality. All right. So, and then Mark Stallman is the one who reminded me about the spiritual faculties within Catholicism,
Mm.
and which is interesting because I don't know if you've had this experience, but a lot of times when you do research, you start to realize that this question that you're now engaged in learning about was a question that you may have had when you were 18, or you may have
Yeah.
had when you were 25, and you're like, ah, this is the answer to that question I had back then. So
Hmm.
when I went through graduate school and undergraduate, I was keenly interested in this unanswerable question that Immanuel Kant was getting at in his critique of judgment. So he did, the critique of reason and all those really famous things that we read when we're a philosophy major and so forth. But then he gets to critique of judgment because it flummoxes him. He's like, there's something else there, and I don't quite understand it. It seems to be another sense that we have, but he can't actually get a hold of it because he's looking at it from purely rational, ways of seeing things. So he does this and he passes away before he finishes it, right? None other than Hannah Arendt takes it up
Mm.
at the end of her life, when, Hannah Arendt is the philosopher who knew Heidegger, was a student of Heidegger's, Jewish, um, was interned at, I believe it was Bergen-Belsen, the concentration
Okay.
camp, and she escaped and came to the United States and became a philosopher at Columbia. I think it's Columbia.
Hmm.
Okay, so she's a philosopher and she's writing a lot of commentary about how did Germans do this? How did they get themselves into this? Why? And she wondered if it was something about thinking. And she went back to the critique of judgment, Kant's critique of judgment. And that was what she was fixing or writing about when she passed away, right? So, so both of them were trying to figure out. She thought of it as more in moral terms, whereas
Hmm.
Kant was thinking of it more in, I just don't understand this other sense we have. And she was thinking of it in terms of this has something to do with morality. Well, I
Okay.
think if each of them had gone back to the spiritual faculty psychology of the Catholic Church, they may have like understood it differently. But
Hmm.
then I don't know. But this is what I'm trying to bring back in this book that I'm writing about now, is this idea of the spiritual faculty as a kind of moral evolution. So that's
Hmm.
what Chardon brought to me, was that he saw this coming. He felt it happening, and he wrote about it in his poetic mystical prose, right? And
Hmm.
and related it to, you know, I mean, he was a visionary, let's just say that.
Sure.
Visionaries often have ways of writing that people are at the time, they don't like them, right?
Yeah.
Because they don't understand it. Um,
Yeah.
and he was writing so long ago about what seems to be happening today. Um, I always feel bad about those kinds of people, by the way, because, they're so misunderstood. They're onto something, but in their own time, same kind of thing with Nietzsche, I guess, right? So, he was really open about it. He said, I'm writing for philosophers in the future.
Hmm.
He just said it. So in
Hmm.
a sense, I see Chardon like that too. But the spiritual faculty is something that is a moral evolution, this idea of moral evolution. So this idea that we've done a lot scientifically, we've done a lot technologically, but more morally, we haven't really
Mm.
done that. We could do better.
Yeah. Yeah, there are all these fronts on which we can evolve and develop ourselves. And Teilhard saw that as this energy of the universe that were universal energy, this cosmic energy, concentrated itself within the planet Earth. And then the spirit of the earth was expressing that cosmic energy in the form of human energy. So we have we're like metabolizing the cosmic energy within our very beings, as we mentioned before, personally, but then collectively. And that's a challenge. But there is a commonality to be found, and that's that realm of spirit, that realm of interiority, that, like you said, has fallen out of practice within like mainstream Catholicism for the most part. Just speaking briefly about some of my own experiences recently with liturgy is just like, am I at a Protestant worship service? Like, what are these songs they're playing, in preparing the table for the Eucharist or something like that? And I'm not like like a yeah, like a brand Catholic where, I'm like rah rah team Catholic. Like I said, I've worked for the church most of my life. I have a lot of criticism for it. I've grown a lot within it too. So it's holding that all together. But it's something that, like you mentioned earlier, like, it's an area that people don't want to go to. It's an area that instills a lot of uncertainty, but that really is the call of faith, no matter what faith you're practicing, is to be more comfortable with being uncomfortable, to make you more certain about uncertainty in life. And I really feel like those are the areas where we evolve the most, right? And going back to the point earlier about the gentleman who you brought with you, who was an aerospace guy, witnessing this devotional life of the professed and having a profound conversion because of that. I would say like that's a mystical experience, right? Like there's maybe not rapture or any sort of crazy visuals he's having, but just that lived, slow, steady witness is something that is irreplaceable in some ways and can't be taught. It can't be forced on you. It's just something you have to live. This emergent consciousness that is within the universe, we look at the universe as this unfolding process, and it's not this static state. How does this emerging consciousness that is being highlighted by the phenomenon and all this expansion in our field of perception, Al, in terms of, hey, like you said, we need to study this stuff. We need to take it seriously. How is that going to affect our epistemology, do you think? Like the way we see and understand the world as that continues to evolve?
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. First, I see several things happening. First, it'll of course open our minds, um, and that's good. And
Mhm.
it'll put some pressure on practitioners of religion. Maybe good
Yeah.
pressure, and also maybe pressure that helps them change, right? So once they see this, maybe they'll go back to their own religions and start reassessing. I noticed that when I was interviewing people who had experiences with UFOs, if they were from a religious tradition, a lot of times it will first make them really upset and even frightened. And then with time, they'd go back to their religious tradition and find what kinds of protocols were in place for dealing
Mhm.
with non-human intelligences. And then they would reassess their own religiosity. And it turned out well, right? So it didn't, a lot of people in the government would ask me, what's going to happen to people who are religious when they learn that there are these, things out there? And I said, it'll be good for them. It'll reinforce their religion. And they didn't think that at all. They thought that their religion would crumble. And
Mhm.
that's entirely not the case. And I didn't
Mhm.
do it. Wasn't just me who's done a study of this. There's another person who did like a big study of what would happen to these people, their religiosity. Well, for the most part, it gets reinforced.
Mhm.
I think because at the heart of a lot of religions, traditional religions, is the idea of a spectrum of intelligences in the universe, like not just human intelligences, but God, whatever God is for that, religion, traditional religion. You'll see that there are other forms of beings that are not just animals, right?
Right.
And then there are actually protocols for dealing with those. And I think that would be good to bring back those protocols, like to reassess them, to keep what helps. Um, this might be scary to people in your audience, but I've had a lot of conversations with exorcists, like way more than I've ever had in my life, right?
Sure. Mhm.
So exorcists a lot of times identify different forms of beings. In the Catholic tradition, they're going to be angels and demons and things like that, right? Call upon the
Mhm.
angels for help. in order to exorcise a demon. So they do have protocols for things that are non-human intelligences.
Right.
These protocols, I think we shouldn't be afraid of. We shouldn't stigmatize them. We shouldn't, because they're there, they were there for many years for a reason. And now that we're entering an age when our own government is telling us that these things, yet things that we don't understand exist, um, it's it's good for us to look back at our religious traditions and look at those protocols again.
Yeah, and I think that there's like we've approached this kind of throughout our whole conversation. There's a way you can look at those protocols and take them at face value, which there is a value there, right? If someone is legitimately possessed by a demon or the devil or something to that effect. Um, Yet I know that most exorcists would like rule that as like the last thing, right? They look at all
Oh,
these
definitely.
natural causes up
Yeah.
front. So that speaks to this notion of, those protocols aren't just like if you're only Catholic, they work on you, right? There is something deeper there. There is a deeper level of the psyche or the soul it's taking you to, is taking one to, because certainly within other, religions too, there's other belief forms of possession and whatnot. So yeah, I don't think that scares people. I think what scares people is Hollywood's portrayal of exorcisms,
Yeah,
which
I think so
I
too.
know you have a storied history with. But yeah, I mean, and that's why they consult people like you and priests who have been involved in that, because I think they want to depict it in a somewhat realistic way, and also sell tickets too. But yeah, I mean, that is, a more hyper focused commentary rather on like how we approach religion, right?
Mhm.
And like people say like through him, with him, in him, they're saying during the mass, well, what is him? Who's happening to him, right? Like you can take it on that level, or you can go deeper, right? You can go deeper than just that historical person of Jesus of Nazareth, and you can take it to that level, deeper, more expansive, higher, wherever you want to situate it on the graph, of the cosmic Christ, of something that's much more integral and encompassing and applies to all humanity, not just people that profess to be Catholic or Christian or Buddhist or whatever it may be, right?
Mhm.
Um, and really, that takes us as we kind of wind down our conversation now. I've been very grateful for your time today. And this is a topic we talked about offline, was this notion of the ultrahuman. It was the fellow Jesuit of Teilhard, Karl Rahner, who wrote something to the effect that the Christian of the future will be a mystic or they will not exist at all. And Teilhard talks about this notion of the ultrahuman, implying that we are not done our evolution. For Teilhard, our evolution is not something that means like our physical expansion. I mean, maybe we are still physically evolving in some way, but really what he was looking at was this involution or this inner expansion that we experience when we do touch the mystical, when we learn to cultivate that spiritual sense, when we delve into that interior dimension of our spiritual life. So, I'm just curious where your thought and study has taken you on this topic of, what does it mean to be ultra human, and like, where do you think and how do you think we're evolving to that?
This is a great question. So, in writing about technology in the Catholic history, I came upon the realization and also the sources that indicated that it was Dante who wrote about the human becoming like a transhuman. And I'm not talking about transhuman in the sense technologically human, right? A
Right.
cyborg or anything like that. He was basically talking about Beatrice becoming transfigured, right? So she
Mhm.
became transfixed by the sight of God, the beatific vision. And that completely changed her. And he witnessed it. And that's what he wrote about. And that was when, they're going up through the different levels and they get to the very apex, right, of God. And I always thought that was interesting because perhaps I don't know what he means by ultrahuman, but I think that's something that he's talking about is that on
Mhm.
not just one person, a saint or so forth, but communities of people who can share being transfigured by God, really.
Mhm.
And isn't that what Jesus calls us to do, right? So perhaps that is what he's talking about. And again, I'm not an expert on him, and nor am I a theologian, but coming from a person who does this historical work and looking at the sources of historical sources of Catholic tradition, um, I would venture that that's what he means by that, is exactly what Ronner meant, that the mystical union is a transfigured state.
Well, that was beautifully put. The way you just said that is individuals and communities being transfigured by God. And I think that's a beautiful way to describe the ultrahuman. Well, Diana, thank you so much for your willingness to connect today and for your openness on these topics. I'm sure that your journey has not been easy at times with these things, as you wrestle probably both internally and then externally with all sorts of factors. And I would imagine even probably like clearances and stuff too, as you work with the alphabet agencies and whatnot. But you're doing a really important job in terms of making this accessible to the public. I love the way that American Cosmic is written in really kind of this narrative form of your journey, of being, initiated, if you will, into this world and all of the secrets of it. And you're a part of this larger ecosystem now of how we're getting this information. And it seems to be resonating on so many levels. I mean, really, again, grateful for your time today. I know you've done a lot of podcasts. If you pull up your name on any podcast apps, there's so many episodes that you've done. So really grateful that you were kind enough to give up your time here today. And our audience, in terms of the ATA, is really inquisitive. They are Catholic in the lowercase c sense, where they're really a universal audience. They may come from a Roman Catholic background or some sort of Christian background. But I've met plenty of people within the organization and who tune into this podcast who may be Buddhists or, of other world faiths. And I really think that you'll be a welcome addition to this community in terms of your thought and your work and your books that are out there. So could you share where folks can find you, and whether it's on the web or social media? And you have a new book that's going to be coming out later this year. Is that right?
Yes, yes, I have a new book. I'm finishing it this summer, and I think it's going to be published sometime in 2025, and it'll be about this topic that we've talked about today, and AI and that type of thing. I don't know the title yet, but the supraterrestrial will be in the title because that's a
Okay.
McCarthy term, and I thought it was really good. Um, and so my book, American Cosmic, and then my follow-up book to that is called Encounters, and those are both on Amazon. And I also have a website, dwpasulka.com. And I also teach classes, non-university classes on this topic, and information there is on my website. And I'm on X and Instagram and LinkedIn, and I think that's it. I try not to be on too much, by the way. I'm like, uh, but yeah, I am as DW Pasulka.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of your work. And for our listeners or viewers today who are interested in really where they can find Teilhard within Dr. Pasulka's work, certainly, in her body of work, but specifically within Encounters. There's a chapter in there that really focuses on Teilhard, a Marine, his experience in combat, Teilhard's experience in combat, and the Noosphere in particular. So if you're looking to really dive into where Diana explores Teilhard, that's one place to look. So Diana, thank you again so much for your time today. It really was a pleasure to be able to talk with you and unpack these topics. And I look forward to your work as it continues to come out.
Thank you.